Some nights, Dylan Hart lay awake, listening to his 9-year-old daughter cough in the next room, knowing he couldn't afford the doctor visit she needed. The widowed carpenter was 3 weeks behind on rent, and winter was coming fast to their small Oregon town. That morning, Dylan went into the woods to cut firewood. His axe struck a hollow log and split it open. Inside were waterproof cases filled with $47 million in cash and a simple note: "If you found this, you need it, but if you're brave enough, follow the map." The money belonged to Rowan Vale, a tech billionaire who had vanished 11 months earlier. Everyone thought he was dead, but this note meant he had planned his disappearance. Dylan faced a choice: take the money and run, or follow the map and discover why a billionaire would leave his fortune in the woods. What was Rowan Vale really hiding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Dylan Hart's workshop, casting long shadows across the collection of hand tools that had once belonged to his wife. Sarah had bought them for their 5th anniversary, back when they thought they had all the time in the world to build the furniture business together. Now, 3 years after losing her to cancer, those tools represented the last connection to their shared dreams and his only means of keeping food on the table for Lily. Dylan ran his calloused fingers along the smooth handle of the chisel Sarah had wrapped in blue ribbon that Christmas morning. She'd insisted on buying quality tools, even though money was tight then too. "These will last longer than we will," she'd said with that gentle smile that still visited his dreams. She'd been wrong about that. The tools remained, but she was gone at 31, leaving Dylan to navigate single parenthood in a town where work was scarce and medical bills multiplied like autumn leaves. The workshop occupied half of their rented garage, a cramped but organized space where Dylan crafted custom cabinets and repaired furniture for the handful of clients who still valued handmade work. The other half housed his aging pickup truck, its paint faded and engine temperamental, but it ran reliably enough to haul materials and completed projects to customers scattered across 3 counties. On good months, he made enough to cover rent on their 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. On bad months, like the past 3, he borrowed against hope and prayed Mrs. Chen would extend his patience another week. Lily's cough echoed from the kitchen, that persistent hack that had worried Dylan for weeks. Dr. Martinez at the community clinic had prescribed an inhaler and suggested tests that Dylan couldn't afford. The inhaler helped some, but the cough returned each night, settling deep in her chest like an unwelcome tenant. Dylan had called the clinic twice, asking about payment plans, but even those stretched beyond his reach. Pride warred with desperation as he considered asking his brother Marcus for another loan, though Marcus had his own family to support in Portland. "Dad, the pancakes are burning," Lily called, her voice raspy but cheerful. She always tried to help with breakfast, standing on her step-stool at the stove, her dark hair so much like Sarah's falling across her face as she concentrated on flipping pancakes with more enthusiasm than skill. Dylan hurried inside, turning off the burner and sliding the pan to a cool spot. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're getting better at this." Lily beamed up at him, her brown eyes bright despite the shadows beneath them. "Mom used to make them perfect circles. Mine look like clouds." "Clouds are beautiful too," Dylan said, plating the misshapen pancakes and adding a careful drizzle of syrup. They'd learned to make everything stretch: syrup, butter, even hope. Their kitchen was small but warm, with Sarah's hand-painted ceramic canisters still arranged on the counter and her recipe cards tucked into the frame of the window that looked out on their postage-stamp backyard. Dylan had kept everything exactly as she'd left it, partly from sentiment and partly because change felt like another kind of loss. Lily seemed to draw comfort from the continuity, often sitting at the same spot where her mother used to read the morning paper. "Mrs. Chen stopped by yesterday while you were at the Miller job," Lily said between bites. "She brought me cookies shaped like leaves." Dylan's stomach tightened. Mrs. Chen owned their rental house and 3 others on the block. She was kind but practical, a widow herself who understood hardship but couldn't afford unlimited charity. Her visits usually meant reminders about overdue rent, delivered with gentle firmness and homemade treats that somehow made the conversations both easier and harder. "What did you two talk about?" Dylan asked, keeping his voice casual. "She asked if you were feeling okay. She said you looked tired." Lily studied her father's face with the perceptiveness that sometimes startled him. "Are you tired, Dad?" "Just the regular kind of tired," Dylan said, which was partially true. He was tired, bone deep, soul-weary, tired from juggling bills and worries, and the constant calculation of which necessity could wait another week. But there was another kind of exhaustion that came from watching his daughter's health concerns mount, while his ability to address them dwindled. After breakfast, Dylan walked Lily to school, a 6-block journey that took them past the heart of their small town. Millfield had once thrived on timber and agriculture, but those industries had largely moved on, leaving behind a community of 8,000 people who made do with service jobs, small businesses, and the quiet dignity of rural perseverance. The main street still held a few original shops: Peterson's Hardware, Maria's Diner, the First National Bank with its 1960s brick facade, but empty storefronts punctuated the blocks like missing teeth. Lily's school was a single-story brick building that served kindergarten through 8th grade, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that dropped their cones like gifts during autumn storms. Dylan watched his daughter join the stream of children flowing through the front doors, her backpack bouncing with each step. She turned and waved before disappearing inside, and Dylan felt that familiar tug of pride mixed with worry that had become his constant companion. The drive to his current job site took Dylan 15 minutes through winding mountain roads that carved through state forest land. He was installing custom kitchen cabinets for the Hendersons, a retired couple who'd moved from California with enough savings to renovate their lake house. The work was meticulous and well-paying, but it would be finished by week's end, leaving Dylan to search for the next project in a market where handcrafted furniture competed with mass-produced alternatives. The Henderson house sat on 5 wooded acres overlooking Miller Lake, its deck offering views that real estate agents described as breathtaking and priced accordingly. Dylan pulled his truck into the gravel driveway, noting how the morning mist rose from the lake like spirits departing for another world. Sarah would have loved this view. She'd always talked about living somewhere with water, where Lily could learn to fish and swim in clean mountain lakes instead of the chlorinated pool at the community center. Inside, Dylan worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting cabinet doors and installing the final drawer pulls that would complete the kitchen renovation. The Hendersons were kind employers who offered coffee and conversation, but Dylan kept focused on the task. Time was money, and money was everything he didn't have enough of. By noon, he'd finished the installation and collected payment enough to cover 2 weeks of groceries and put something toward the electric bill. The Hendersons recommended him to their neighbors, the kind of word-of-mouth referral that kept his business alive. But Dylan knew that winter would slow construction projects and limit his opportunities. On the drive home, he stopped at Peterson's Hardware to price lumber for a bookshelf project he hoped to start. The familiar smell of sawdust and steel welcomed him as he wandered the aisles, calculating costs against potential profit. At the register, old Pete Peterson tallied his receipt with the deliberate care of a man who'd run the store for 40 years. "How's Lily doing?" Pete asked. News traveled fast in small towns, and her cough hadn't gone unnoticed. "She's a fighter," Dylan replied, which was true, and avoided the larger question of medical care he couldn't afford. Pete nodded with the understanding of a grandfather who'd raised his own children through lean times. "Kids are tougher than we think, but don't hesitate to ask if you need anything." The offer of help was genuine, Dylan knew, but it came with the weight of obligation he wasn't sure he could repay. He thanked Pete and headed home, stopping at the mailbox with the familiar dread that accompanied each day's delivery. Bills, always bills. The electric company, the clinic, the hospital where Sarah had spent her final weeks. Dylan sorted through them in his truck, mentally calculating which could wait and which demanded immediate attention. The eviction notice from Mrs. Chen wasn't there yet, but Dylan felt its approach like a gathering storm. That evening, after helping Lily with homework and sharing a dinner of leftover soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, Dylan tucked her into bed with her favorite book about a girl who could talk to forest animals. Lily's cough was quieter tonight, maybe from the humidifier he'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen, or maybe just from exhaustion. "Dad," Lily said as he turned off her bedside lamp, "I dreamed about Mom last night." Dylan sat on the edge of her bed. "What did you dream?" She was standing in a forest, but it wasn't scary. It was like she was waiting for something good to happen. Lily's eyes reflected the hallway light. "Do you think Mom knows we're okay?" The question pierced Dylan's heart with its innocence and hope. "I think she knows we love each other, and we're doing our best." "That's probably enough," Lily said, settling into her pillow. Later, alone in his own bedroom, Dylan stared at the ceiling and listened to his daughter's irregular breathing through the thin wall. The medical bills on his dresser seemed to glow in the darkness, reminders of all the ways he was failing to protect the most important person in his world. He thought about Sarah's last words to him in the hospital. "Take care of our girl." Simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime's responsibility. Tomorrow he would cut firewood. Winter was coming, and they needed fuel for the wood stove that heated their house. It was honest work that cost nothing but time and effort, and Dylan had plenty of both. The state forest land began just 3 miles from town, accessible by old logging roads that few people used anymore. He could cut enough wood in a morning to last them through the coldest months, assuming he could keep the house long enough to need it. As Dylan finally drifted towards sleep, he wondered if Sarah's spirit really did watch over them, and if so, whether she approved of the choices he was making to keep their small family afloat. He hoped she understood that love sometimes meant compromise, that doing your best wasn't always enough, and that tomorrow would bring another day of trying to be the father Lily deserved, even when the odds seemed stacked against them both. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate patterns that reminded Dylan of Sarah's lace curtains. Lily's cough had worsened overnight, each harsh bark from her bedroom sending worry deeper into his chest. Dylan made the decision to keep her home from school, though it meant losing a day's work on the Morrison fence repair project. "Just a scratchy throat," Lily insisted between coughs, but her pale complexion and the way she leaned against the kitchen counter told a different story. "Rest day," Dylan said firmly, settling her on the couch with blankets and her sketch pad. "I'm going to cut some firewood so we'll be warm when the real cold hits." "Can I come?" she asked hopefully. "Not today, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen said she'd check on you in an hour." He kissed her forehead, relieved that she didn't feel feverish. "I'll be back before lunch." Dylan loaded his chainsaw, splitting maul and wedges into the truck bed, along with a thermos of coffee and the hope that honest labor might quiet the anxious calculations running through his mind. The eviction notice would come soon. Mrs. Chen's kindness had limits, and 3 weeks of missed rent tested even the most patient landlord. The logging road into the state forest wound through stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, their trunks disappearing into morning mist like cathedral columns supporting an invisible roof. Dylan had been cutting firewood here for years, always careful to follow regulations and take only deadfall or trees marked by Forest Service personnel. It was one of the few benefits of living in timber, country-abundant fuel for those willing to work for it. He parked in a clearing where a winter storm had brought down several large trees, their broken trunks and scattered branches, promising enough wood to last through spring. The chainsaw started on the third pull, its 2-stroke engine settling into a familiar rhythm that always reminded Dylan of his father, who'd taught him to cut wood when he was barely tall enough to reach the starter rope. 2 hours later, Dylan had bucked the downed trees into manageable lengths and split enough rounds to fill his truck bed twice over. The physical work felt good, each swing of the maul releasing some of the tension that had accumulated like sediment in his shoulders and back. This was something he could control, a problem he could solve with nothing but effort and determination. He was working on a particularly stubborn piece of fir, the grain twisted from years of mountain winds, when his axe struck something that gave with a hollow thunk instead of the solid resistance of wood. Dylan stopped, examining the log more carefully. What he'd taken for a fallen tree was actually the hollow shell of an ancient Douglas fir, its heartwood long since rotted away, leaving only the thick outer bark and sapwood intact. The axe had split through the shell, revealing a dark cavity within. Dylan pried the opening wider with his hands, expecting to find the usual collection of forest debris, rotted leaves, insect nests, maybe a small animal's den. Instead, his fingers encountered something smooth and artificial. Waterproof cases, 3 of them, each about the size of a briefcase, made from military-grade polymer and sealed with heavy-duty latches. Dylan's heart began to pound as he pulled them from their hiding place, the weight substantial enough to suggest something far more valuable than camping supplies or buried treasure from someone's childhood game. The first case opened with a soft click, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills secured with bank bands. Dylan had never seen so much cash in one place. The bills were crisp, sequential, and obviously new. The second case contained more of the same, and the third held not only money but also a sealed envelope and what appeared to be some kind of electronic device. Dylan's hands shook as he opened the envelope, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The handwriting was precise, written with an expensive pen on heavy paper that felt foreign in his calloused fingers. "If you found this, you need it. But if you're brave enough, follow the map." The signature read, "R. Vale," in the same careful script. Rowan Vale. Dylan knew that name from news reports that had dominated headlines 11 months ago. The tech billionaire who'd built a fortune developing water purification systems then vanished without explanation from his Seattle headquarters. The FBI had investigated, his company's stock had crashed, and conspiracy theories had flourished online. Some people thought he'd been murdered by business rivals. Others suggested he'd staged his own death to escape embezzlement charges. A few claimed alien abduction. But this note suggested something else entirely. Vale had planned his disappearance, and for reasons Dylan couldn't begin to understand, he'd left a fortune hidden in the Oregon woods. Dylan counted the money with growing disbelief. $47 million. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, enough to solve every problem that kept him awake at night. Lily's medical care, the overdue rent, her college education, a house of their own, all of it within reach, if he simply loaded these cases into his truck and drove away. The electronic device appeared to be some kind of GPS unit, its screen showing a detailed topographical map with coordinates marked in red. 3 locations formed a rough triangle across the Cascade Mountains, each marked with cryptic symbols that meant nothing to Dylan, but suggested a larger plan at work. He sat in the forest clearing for a long time, surrounded by the split wood he'd come to gather and the fortune he'd never expected to find. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks like a question he couldn't answer. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons to take the money and run his daughter's health, their precarious housing situation, the simple fact that $47 million could change everything for them. But another part of him, the part that had listened to Sarah, read fairy tales where the moral choice was always rewarded, wondered why a billionaire would hide his fortune in a hollow log and challenge someone to follow a map. What kind of test was this? What did Vale want from whoever found his money? Dylan thought about Lily, probably curled up on their couch at that moment, drawing pictures of forests and animals while her cough echoed through their small house. She deserved better than uncertainty, better than a father who couldn't afford to take her to the doctor when she was sick. The money could give her that security, but it could also make them fugitives. $47 million didn't just disappear without people looking for it. The FBI, Vale's company, may be dangerous people who'd had their own plans for that fortune. They would all want answers that Dylan couldn't provide. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Sarah's voice reminded him that some gifts came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. Dylan carefully returned the money to its cases and sealed them back inside the hollow log, though he kept the note and the GPS device. He needed time to think, to research, to understand what he was stepping into before he made a decision that would affect Lily's entire future. The drive home passed in a blur of possibility and worry. Dylan's truck seemed to carry the weight of more than firewood, each mile bringing new questions about Vale's motives and the wisdom of following a dead man's treasure map. By the time he reached Maple Street, he'd made his decision, at least a temporary one. He would find out what Rowan Vale really wanted before he claimed a fortune that might come with consequences he couldn't predict. For Lily's sake, he had to be sure that the greatest treasure he'd ever found wouldn't become the most dangerous mistake he'd ever made. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep with the humidifier running steadily beside her bed, Dylan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, a second-hand machine that Sarah had used for her online bookkeeping courses. The screen flickered occasionally, and the fan ran constantly, but it connected him to a world of information about Rowan Vale that painted a picture far more complex than the news reports had suggested. Vale had built his fortune on something called atmospheric water generation technology that could literally pull drinking water from air, even in desert conditions. His company, Aquatech Industries, held dozens of patents for systems that could provide clean water to drought-stricken regions and communities without access to traditional water sources. The technology wasn't just profitable, it was revolutionary, with the potential to address one of humanity's most pressing challenges. But Vale himself remained an enigma. The son of a Montana rancher, he'd earned engineering degrees from MIT and Stanford before disappearing into the tech world for a decade. When he emerged, it was with water purification technology that worked better than anything the industry had seen. Aquatech went public 3 years ago, making Vale a billionaire almost overnight. Then, 11 months ago, he'd simply vanished. Security footage showed him leaving his Seattle office building at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. His car was found abandoned at a trailhead in the North Cascades, keys still in the ignition. Nobody was ever recovered, though search teams had combed the wilderness for weeks. Dylan studied photographs of Vale from various business publications. Mid-40s, tall and lean, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to carry some burden the camera couldn't quite capture. In every photo, even those taken at company celebrations or award ceremonies, Vale looked like a man who knew something, others didn't, something that made him profoundly sad. The GPS device sat beside Dylan's laptop, its screen displaying the first set of coordinates with military precision. The location was roughly 30 miles northeast of Millfield, in an area Dylan knew well from hunting trips with his father years ago. An old fire tower stood there, abandoned since the Forest Service had switched to satellite monitoring systems. It would be a 2-hour hike through rough terrain, assuming the logging roads were still passable. Dylan closed the laptop and studied the handwritten note again. Vale's penmanship was careful, almost artistic, the kind of writing that came from someone who'd been taught to value precision in all things. The paper itself was expensive, with a watermark Dylan couldn't quite make out in the kitchen's fluorescent light. If you found this, you need it, but if you're brave enough, follow the map. The words suggested Vale had chosen this location deliberately, that he'd expected someone like Dylan to find the money. But why? What could a billionaire tech entrepreneur possibly want from a struggling carpenter in a small Oregon town? Dylan spent the next morning researching the fire tower location, while Lily rested on the couch, her cough slightly better but still concerning. Mrs. Chen had stopped by with soup and gentle inquiries about rent that Dylan deflected with promises and gratitude he couldn't quite sustain. The clock was ticking on multiple fronts: Lily's health, their housing situation, and now this mysterious challenge from a missing billionaire. By noon, Dylan had made his decision. He would follow the first set of coordinates alone and see what Vale had left for whoever was brave enough to accept his challenge. If it led to answers that justified taking the money, he would proceed. If it led to danger or legal complications, He would walk away and find another solution to his problems. "I need to run an errand," Dylan told Mrs. Chen when she arrived to check on Lily. "Work-related. I should be back by evening." Mrs. Chen's knowing look suggested she understood more than she was saying, but she simply nodded and settled into the rocking chair beside the couch where Lily was drawing pictures of woodland creatures. The drive to the trailhead took Dylan through increasingly remote country, past abandoned logging camps and clear-cuts that was slowly returning to forest. The road ended at a rusted gate that bore faded Forest Service warnings about fire danger and seasonal closures. Dylan parked his truck and shouldered a day pack containing water, energy bars, and the GPS device that would guide him to whatever Vale had hidden in the wilderness. The trail began as a maintained path, but quickly devolved into a deer track that wound through stands of old-growth timber and across granite outcroppings where wildflowers bloomed in unlikely crevices. Dylan's legs felt strong after months of physical labor, and he made good time despite the rough terrain. The silence was profound, broken only by his footsteps and the occasional call of a varied thrush echoing through the canopy. 2 hours later, the fire tower appeared through the trees like a skeletal monument to a bygone era. The steel structure rose 60 feet above the forest floor, its observation cabin dark and weather-beaten. A sign at the base warned of structural instability and liability for trespassers, but the ladder rungs looked solid enough to support Dylan's weight. The GPS coordinates led him not to the tower itself, but to a granite boulder at its base, partially hidden by a thicket of manzanita bushes. Dylan circled the rock formation until he found what he was looking for, a shallow depression where someone had carefully placed another waterproof container, this one smaller than the cases in the hollow log, but sealed with the same military-grade precision. Inside was a tablet computer, its screen protected by a rugged case designed for outdoor use. Dylan powered it on, and after a moment of loading, Rowan Vale's face appeared on the screen. "If you're watching this," Vale said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent too much time indoors, "then you found the money and decided to follow the map instead of simply taking what you needed. That tells me something important about your character." Vale was sitting in what appeared to be a well-appointed office, though the lighting was artificial and the background generic enough to offer no clues about location. He looked older than in the business photographs Dylan had studied, with deeper lines around his eyes and a pallor that suggested serious illness. "My name is Rowan Vale, and if you're seeing this message, I'm probably dead. Not from violence or accident, but from the same cancer that killed my wife 8 years ago. The doctors gave me 6 months 11 months ago, which means I've been living on borrowed time for quite a while now." Dylan's breath caught. Cancer. The same disease that had taken Sarah, leaving behind the same hollow ache that Vale's voice now carried. "I disappeared because there were people who wanted to bury my life's work along with me. Aquatech Industries isn't just a company, it's the culmination of everything I've learned about bringing clean water to places where it doesn't exist. The technology we've developed could save millions of lives, but it threatens billions of dollars in existing water markets. Some people prefer the status quo to progress." Vale paused, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that made Dylan feel like the billionaire was speaking to him personally across the months and miles that separated them. "The money you found is real, and it's yours if you want it. No strings attached, no legal complications. I made sure of that before I disappeared. But if you're curious about why I hid it, and if you're willing to help me finish something that matters more than money, there are 2 more locations marked on that device. Each one will tell you more about what I'm really trying to accomplish." The message ended with coordinates for the second location and a challenge that echoed in Dylan's mind as he powered down the tablet and began the long hike back to his truck. Vale hadn't just hidden money in the forest. He'd hidden a test, a way to find someone willing to look beyond immediate need toward larger purpose. Dylan understood now why the billionaire had chosen this remote location for his first message. Anyone willing to climb to an abandoned fire tower instead of simply taking the money and running, was someone who might be worthy of a larger trust. As Dylan drove home through the gathering dusk, he found himself thinking not just about the $47 million waiting in a hollow log, but about the man who'd hidden it there and the work he'd died trying to complete. For the first time since Sarah's death, Dylan felt the stirring of something beyond mere survival, the possibility that his life might serve a purpose larger than simply getting through each day. But first, he had to decide whether he was truly brave enough to see where Rowan Vale's map would lead him next. Dylan returned home to find Lily's cough had worsened, despite Mrs. Chen's careful attention. The older woman met him at the door with worry etched in the lines around her eyes, and Dylan could hear his daughter's labored breathing from the living room. "She's been asking for you," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "The cough got worse around 4 o'clock. I think she needs to see a doctor." Dylan knelt beside the couch where Lily lay curled under Sarah's favorite quilt, her face flushed with fever that hadn't been there that morning, when she opened her eyes and smiled weakly at him. Dylan's heart clenched with a familiar terror, the same helpless fear he'd felt watching Sarah's condition deteriorate beyond his ability to fix or afford proper treatment. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Like there's an elephant sitting on my chest," Lily whispered, then coughed a harsh, wet sound that sent alarm bells through Dylan's mind. After Mrs. Chen left with promises to return in the morning, Dylan faced a decision that crystallized everything he'd been avoiding. Lily needed medical attention tonight, not next week when he might have scraped together enough money for a clinic visit. The emergency room would treat her regardless of his ability to pay, but the resulting bills would bury them deeper in debt than they already were. Unless he took the money from the hollow log. Dylan sat in his workshop that night, Sarah's wedding ring rolling between his fingers like a talisman of all the choices he'd made and failed to make since losing her. He'd bought the ring with money saved from his first carpentry jobs, back when their future seemed as solid as the oak furniture he'd crafted for their tiny apartment. Sarah had worn it for 12 years, through good times and lean ones, never once suggesting he should have bought something smaller to better match their budget. Now the ring represented his last resort, the one asset he could sell to pay for Lily's medical care. Several times over the past year, he'd driven to the pawn shop in the county seat, the ring warm in his pocket like a guilty secret. Each time, he'd turned around before going inside, unable to part with the last physical reminder of his marriage. But tonight was different. Tonight, Lily's breathing sounded wrong, in a way that made Dylan's chest tight with paternal panic. If she got worse, if something happened because he'd been too proud or too conflicted to take money that was apparently his, for the taking, he would never forgive himself. Dylan pulled up Vale's first video message on the tablet and watched it again, studying the billionaire's face for clues about his true intentions. Vale looked like a man carrying enormous weight, someone who understood the burden of impossible choices. His mention of cancer, of time running out, resonated with Dylan's own experience of watching someone he loved slip away despite all his efforts to save them. "The money you found is real, and it's yours if you want it. No strings attached, no legal complications." Vale's words offered exactly what Dylan needed: a solution that didn't require sacrifice or compromise, that could solve Lily's medical crisis and their housing situation without forcing him to surrender the last connection to his wife. But the billionaire's challenge remained. Follow the map, learn about his real purpose, help finish something that mattered more than money. Dylan made his decision based on the sound of his daughter's labored breathing from the next room. He would take enough money to pay for her medical care and catch up on their rent, then decide whether to follow Vale's map based on what he learned about the billionaire's larger purpose. If the remaining locations revealed something dangerous or illegal, he would walk away with enough to secure Lily's immediate future. If they revealed something worthy of the risks involved, he would consider going deeper into whatever game Vale had created. The next morning brought no improvement in Lily's condition. If anything, her fever had spiked higher overnight, and her cough had developed a wheeze that Dylan recognized from Sarah's final weeks in the hospital. Martinez would want chest x-rays, blood tests, possibly antibiotics that required prescription monitoring. The community clinic could provide basic care, but serious respiratory issues often meant referral to specialists in the city specialists who demanded payment up front. Dylan called in sick to the Morrison fence job and drove to the forest with a sense of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. The hollow log yielded its treasure as easily as before, the waterproof cases heavy with possibility and consequence. Dylan took exactly what he calculated he needed, $50,000 for medical bills and back rent, leaving the remainder of Vale's fortune untouched. The money felt strange in his hands, crisp and clean in a way that seemed divorced from the labor that usually produced his income. But it also felt like salvation, like the answer to prayers he'd been too proud to voice. With this cushion, he could focus on Lily's recovery, instead of the crushing arithmetic of poverty that had dominated his thoughts for months. Dr. Martinez confirmed Dylan's fears. Lily had developed pneumonia, likely bacterial, requiring immediate antibiotic treatment and monitoring that could extend to hospitalization if her condition didn't improve quickly. The doctor's concern was evident as he listened to her labored breathing and noted her elevated white blood cell count. "We need to start aggressive treatment today," Dr. Martinez said. "I'm prescribing antibiotics and a nebulizer for home use. But if she's not significantly better in 48 hours, we'll need to consider admission to Children's Hospital in Portland." For the first time in months, Dylan didn't feel the familiar panic at mention of medical procedures and their associated costs. "Whatever she needs," he said, meaning it completely. The next few days passed in a blur of medication schedules, nebulizer treatments, and gradual improvement that felt like watching the sun rise after the longest night of the year. Lily's fever broke on the third day, and her cough began to loosen, allowing her to sleep through the night for the first time in weeks. Dylan caught up on rent, paid the overdue electric bill, and even managed to buy groceries without calculating the cost of each item. But Vale's challenge remained, and with it the question of what the billionaire had really been trying to accomplish with his elaborate treasure hunt. Dylan found himself studying the GPS coordinates for the second location, wondering what message Vale had left there, and whether it would justify the risk of continuing deeper into whatever plan the dead man had constructed. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dylan was reading to Lily from her favorite book about forest animals when she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 9 years. "Dad," she said, "when Mom was sick, did you ever wish you could help other kids whose moms were sick too?" The question caught Dylan off guard, with its perceptiveness and compassion. "Yes, sweetheart, I did." "Maybe that's why you found the money," Lily said with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Maybe you're supposed to help people like us." That night, after Lily had fallen into the first peaceful sleep she'd enjoyed in weeks, Dylan made his decision about Vale's second location. He would follow the map not because he needed more money, he'd taken enough for their immediate needs, but because a dying billionaire had challenged him to think beyond his own circumstances, and his daughter had reminded him that the greatest treasures weren't always the ones you kept for yourself. The second coordinates would lead him deeper into Vale's mystery, but they would also lead him toward understanding what the billionaire had meant about work that mattered more than money. For Lily's sake, and for the sake of other children whose parents faced impossible choices, Dylan decided he was brave enough to continue following Rowan Vale's map, wherever it might lead. The second set of coordinates led Dylan to a location he remembered from childhood camping trips with his father Miller's Crossing, where an old mountain highway intersected with a logging road that hadn't seen regular traffic in decades. The area housed the remnants of a truck stop that had served timber crews and long-haul drivers before the interstate bypass made it obsolete. Dylan arrived on a crisp Saturday morning, grateful that Lily's recovery had progressed enough for Mrs. Chen to watch her without medical concern. The abandoned diner sat like a monument to economic change. Its 1970s architecture, weathered but intact, surrounded by empty parking spaces where 18-wheelers had once idled through the night. The GPS device led him to a specific booth inside the diner, its vinyl seats cracked but still recognizable as the kind of place where working people had shared coffee and conversation during better times. Dylan had to force the door, its frame warped by years of mountain weather, but once inside he felt transported to a different era when places like this had been the heartbeat of rural communities. The booth Vale had chosen sat beneath a window that looked out on the intersection where two roads met before disappearing into forest. Someone had maintained minimal electricity to the building. The refrigeration units were dead, but overhead lights still functioned when Dylan found the switch panel. In the designated booth, secured beneath the table with industrial adhesive, he found another waterproof container. This one held a receipt from the diner, dated 18 months ago, long before Vale's disappearance. The paper looked ordinary coffee, pie, total 8.47, but when Dylan examined it under the UV light he'd brought based on his research into modern encryption methods, hidden text appeared in glowing letters across the receipt's surface. GPS coordinates, but also something else. The water flows upward here. Look for the machine that makes miracles. Dylan compared the new coordinates to his topographical maps and identified the location as an area near Crater Lake, roughly 100 miles southeast. The journey would require most of a day, but Vale's message suggested something significant, waited there, something related to water and machinery that the billionaire considered miraculous. Before leaving the diner, Dylan explored the rest of the building, hoping to understand why Vale had chosen this particular location for his second message. In the kitchen, he found evidence of recent activity food containers that weren't decades old, fresh batteries in a flashlight left on the counter, and most tellingly, a notebook filled with handwritten observations about water flow patterns in the surrounding area. The notebook appeared to be Vale's work, documenting seasonal variations in stream levels, groundwater access points, and detailed measurements of something called atmospheric moisture density. The notes were technical, filled with calculations and diagrams that meant little to Dylan, but suggested Vale had spent considerable time studying the hydrology of this remote region. On the drive to Crater Lake, Dylan found himself thinking about Vale's phrase, "The water flows upward here." It sounded poetic, almost mystical, but combined with the technical notes about moisture density, it suggested something more scientific than metaphorical. Vale had been an engineer, someone who dealt in measurable phenomena rather than abstract concepts. The new coordinates led Dylan to a location several miles from the main tourist areas around Crater Lake, accessible only by a rough trail that tested his truck's suspension and his own determination to see Vale's challenge through to its conclusion. The area was known for unique geological features, underground springs that emerged from volcanic rock, creating oases in otherwise dry terrain. Dylan parked where the trail became impassable and hiked the final mile on foot, following the GPS signal through terrain that shifted between dense forest and open meadows where wildflowers bloomed despite the rocky soil. The elevation here was significant, over 6,000 feet, and Dylan found himself breathing harder than the physical exertion alone would justify. He found Vale's device exactly where the coordinates indicated, hidden beneath a cairn of volcanic rocks near what appeared to be a natural spring. But this spring was unlike any Dylan had ever seen. Instead of water bubbling up from underground, moisture seemed to condense directly from the air, forming droplets that collected in a natural basin carved from the volcanic stone. The waterproof container held another tablet, this one containing Vale's second video message. But it also contained something else, a small electronic device that hummed quietly when Dylan touched its activation switch. Within minutes, the device had somehow increased the rate of water condensation around the spring, filling the basin faster than natural processes alone could account for. Vale's face appeared on the tablet screen, and this time he was clearly outdoors, sitting beside what looked like the same spring where Dylan now stood. "If you found this location," Vale said, "then you're beginning to understand what I've been working toward. The device you're holding is a prototype atmospheric water generator technology that can literally pull drinking water from thin air, even in arid conditions where conventional sources don't exist. Dylan looked at the small device in his hands with new respect. It weighed perhaps 5 pounds, required no external power source beyond its internal battery, and was somehow creating clean water from atmospheric moisture in measurable quantities. This prototype can produce 5 gallons of clean water per day in moderate humidity. Vale continued. The commercial version I've been developing could produce 50 times that amount, enough to supply a small village with all the drinking water they need, regardless of local groundwater or surface water availability. The implications began to dawn on Dylan. Technology like this could revolutionize water access in drought-stricken regions, refugee camps, areas affected by natural disasters, anywhere people needed clean water but lacked traditional sources. But here's the problem, Vale said, his expression growing darker. Aquatech Industries is worth billions precisely because water scarcity creates artificial value. If everyone has access to unlimited clean water, that scarcity disappears, along with the market forces that drive profits in the water industry. My own board of directors has been working to bury this technology rather than bring it to market. Dylan understood now why Vale had disappeared rather than simply announcing his breakthrough. The billionaire hadn't just been running from cancer, he'd been running from people who valued profit over human welfare, who would suppress life-saving technology to protect existing business models. The third location contains the master plans for the full-scale version of this device, Vale said. But it also contains something else, evidence of the conspiracy to suppress the technology, including communications from my own executives about eliminating the water abundance problem before it could affect market stability. Vale paused, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that made Dylan feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I need someone I can trust to ensure this technology reaches the people who need it most. The money was just the beginning, a way to find someone who values purpose over immediate profit. If you're willing to take the next step, the third location will show you exactly what's at stake and what I need you to do to complete my work. The message ended with coordinates for the final location and a warning that chilled Dylan despite the afternoon warmth. Be careful. The people who wanted to bury this technology with me are still out there, and they've been monitoring my known associates and properties. By following this map, you've probably already attracted their attention. The third location is secure, but the journey there may not be. Dylan powered down the tablet and sat beside the miraculous spring, watching the atmospheric water generator continue its quiet work of pulling moisture from thin air. He thought about Lily, safe at home with Mrs. Chen, and about all the children around the world who went to bed thirsty because clean water remained beyond their family's reach. Vale had offered him more than money. He'd offered him the chance to be part of something that could genuinely change the world. But he'd also warned that accepting that responsibility meant entering a dangerous game with powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to suppress life-saving technology for profit. As Dylan began the hike back to his truck, he carried with him both the atmospheric water generator and the knowledge that his next decision would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of countless people who deserved access to the most basic necessity of life. The third location waited, along with whatever final test or revelation Vale had prepared for the person brave enough to follow his map to its conclusion. Dylan's decision to continue following Vale's map was solidified that evening when Lily asked him to read from her favorite book about a girl who could talk to forest animals. As he read the passage where the young protagonist chose to help drought-stricken woodland creatures by sharing her family's well water, Dylan realized his daughter had unconsciously drawn a parallel between fiction and their reality. "Dad," Lily said when he finished the chapter, "if you could help people who didn't have clean water, like the animals in the story, would you do it even if it was dangerous?" Dylan looked at his daughter, her color finally returning to normal after the pneumonia scare, and saw Sarah's compassion reflected in her earnest expression. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? You've been different since you found that thing in the woods," Lily said with the perceptiveness that always surprised him. "Happier, but also worried about something big, like when Mum was sick, but opposite. The comparison struck Dylan deeply. During Sarah's illness, he'd felt helpless against forces beyond his control. Now, for the first time since losing her, he faced an opportunity to be part of something larger than his own circumstances, something that could prevent other families from experiencing the desperation he'd known. But first, he needed to understand exactly what Vale had been fighting against. Dylan spent the next few days researching aquatech industries and the global water market, discovering a complex web of corporate interests that profited from scarcity. Companies that controlled water rights, distributed bottled water, or provided expensive purification systems all benefited from limited access to clean water sources. Vale's atmospheric water generation technology threatened to disrupt an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. If anyone could pull unlimited clean water from air using a device that cost a few $1,000s to manufacture, traditional water markets would collapse overnight. The economic implications were staggering, but so were the humanitarian benefits. Dylan also researched Vale's disappearance more thoroughly, finding inconsistencies in the official story that troubled him. The billionaire's car had been found at a trailhead, but search teams had covered thousands of square miles without finding any trace of him. More concerning were the news reports about Aquatech's stock price stabilizing suspiciously quickly after Vale's disappearance, as if investors had been prepared for his exit. Corporate filings revealed that Vale's board of directors had moved with unusual speed to assume control of his patents and research, particularly anything related to atmospheric water generation. Within weeks of his disappearance, Aquatech had announced the indefinite postponement of several humanitarian water projects in Africa and South America, citing technical challenges that Vale himself had apparently solved months earlier. The pattern suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Someone had wanted Vale out of the picture badly enough to orchestrate his disappearance, and they'd moved quickly to suppress the very technology that could have saved millions of lives. Dylan found himself studying the small atmospheric water generator Vale had left at the spring, marveling at its elegant simplicity. The device required no external power beyond solar cells and produced water continuously, as long as atmospheric humidity remained above 20% conditions that existed in most inhabited areas of the world. A larger version could indeed transform water access in regions where drought and poverty intersected to create humanitarian crises. But Vale's warnings about surveillance proved prophetic. On Thursday morning, Dylan noticed a sedan with tinted windows parked across from Lily's school, unusual in a town where everyone knew everyone else's vehicles. The same car appeared outside Peterson's Hardware that afternoon when Dylan stopped for supplies, and again near their house that evening. Dylan's military father had taught him to recognize when he was being watched, and every instinct suggested these weren't federal agents conducting a routine investigation. The surveillance was too obvious, too threatening designed to be noticed rather than hidden. Someone wanted him to know he was being monitored. The message became clearer when Dylan found his workshop door slightly ajar Friday morning, though he distinctly remembered locking it the night before. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the careful arrangement of his tools had been disturbed. Sarah's wedding ring, which he'd taken to carrying in his pocket since the money discovery, felt heavier as he realized someone had searched his private space. That evening, Mrs. Chen approached him with unusual directness. "Dylan, people have been asking questions about you in town. Men in expensive suits who don't belong here. Whatever you've gotten involved in, you need to be careful." Dylan assured her he could handle the situation, but privately he worried about the escalating attention. Vale had warned that following the map would attract dangerous notice, and the evidence suggested corporate interests were willing to use intimidation to protect their water market investments. The third set of coordinates pointed to a location in the remote Steens Mountain area of southeastern Oregon, nearly 300 miles from Millfield. The journey would require an overnight trip through some of the most isolated territory in the Pacific Northwest, exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear without witnesses. But Dylan also realized that backing down now would mean abandoning not just Vale's mission, but the opportunity to ensure Lily grew up in a world where clean water wasn't a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. The atmospheric water generator represented hope for countless families facing the same desperation Dylan had known before finding Vale's fortune. On Saturday morning, Dylan made preparations for what he understood might be a dangerous journey. He left detailed instructions with Mrs. Chen about Lily's care, along with enough of Vale's money to ensure his daughter's security regardless of what happened to him. He also wrote a letter explaining the situation to be opened only if he failed to return within 3 days. "I'm going on a work trip," Dylan told Lily, hating the necessary deception. "Mrs. Chen will take good care of you, and I'll call every evening." "Will you be safe?" Lily asked, studying his face with the intensity that reminded him so much of Sarah. "I'll be as safe as I can be," Dylan answered honestly. "And I'll be working on something important, something that might help a lot of people." Lily nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of whatever mission was calling her father away from their small, safe world. The drive to Steens Mountain took Dylan through increasingly desolate country, past abandoned ranches and ghost towns that marked the retreat of human settlement from Oregon's high desert. He stopped frequently to check his mirrors, confirming that the surveillance team was maintaining distance but definitely following his progress toward Vale's final location. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the sage-covered landscape, Dylan felt the weight of all the choices that had brought him to this point. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a desperate father cutting firewood to keep his daughter warm. Now he was driving toward a confrontation with people who had made a billionaire disappear to protect their corporate interests. But he was also carrying technology that could revolutionize water access for billions of people, along with evidence of a conspiracy to suppress humanitarian innovation for profit. Whatever waited at Vale's third location, Dylan was determined to see the billionaire's mission through to its conclusion, not just for the money, but for the possibility of leaving Lily a world where no child went thirsty because clean water remained beyond their family's reach. The final coordinates were still 50 miles away when Dylan's phone lost signal, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the vast Oregon wilderness stretching endlessly in all directions. Behind him, barely visible in his mirrors, the surveillance team continued their patient pursuit toward whatever revelation or confrontation awaited at Rowan Vale's carefully chosen destination. The final coordinates led Dylan to an area that challenged every assumption he'd made about Rowan Vale's disappearance. Instead of another hidden message or abandoned location, the GPS device directed him to an active solar research facility nestled in a valley between 2 ridges of the Steens Mountains. The installation was clearly occupied solar panels glinted in the late afternoon sun, and smoke rose from a chimney attached to what appeared to be a comfortable living structure. Dylan parked his truck at the facility's gate, noting the sophisticated security systems and the fact that his surveillance team had stopped following him several miles back, as if they knew this location was beyond their reach. A sign identified the installation as High Desert Solar Research Station, with a permit number from the Oregon Department of Energy. Before Dylan could decide whether to approach the main building, a man emerged from what looked like a workshop attached to the living quarters. Dylan recognized him immediately, despite the beard and the 20 pounds he'd lost since his disappearance 11 months earlier. Rowan Vale was very much alive. "Mr. Hart," Vale said, extending his hand with a warmth that seemed genuine, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "I've been hoping you'd make it this far. Please come inside. We have a great deal to discuss." Dylan followed Vale into a solar-powered compound that represented everything the missing billionaire had claimed to stand for. The living space was comfortable but modest, powered entirely by renewable energy and equipped with multiple atmospheric water generation units that provided all the facility's water needs. Technical equipment filled one corner of the main room: computers, communication devices, and prototypes of the water generation technology Dylan had already encountered. "You faked your own death," Dylan said, the reality of the situation still settling in his mind. I staged my disappearance, Vale corrected. There's an important distinction. Everyone assumes I'm dead, which serves my purposes, but I haven't filed false death certificates or committed insurance fraud. I simply vanished in a way that allowed people to draw their own conclusions. Vale gestured for Dillon to sit at a table where documents and photographs were spread out like evidence in a criminal investigation. The question is why someone of your character would follow my map all the way here instead of simply taking the money and solving your immediate problems. Dillon studied the materials on the table: corporate communications, financial records, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs of Vale himself taken in the weeks before his disappearance. Because you convinced me this was about more than money, but you also let me believe you were dead. Would you have taken the challenge seriously if you'd known I was alive and orchestrating events? Vale asked. Would you have made the same moral calculations if you'd understood this was a test rather than a dead man's final request? The question forced Dillon to examine his own motivations more carefully. He'd been inspired partly by the idea of completing a humanitarian mission for someone who couldn't finish it himself. Learning that Vale was alive changed the dynamic significantly. The test was necessary, Vale continued, because what I'm really asking you to do requires someone I can trust completely. The atmospheric water generation technology you've seen is ready for global deployment, but releasing it safely requires someone outside the corporate structure who can't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated as easily as I could be. Vale opened a laptop and showed Dillon video footage that made his blood run cold. The surveillance team that had followed him from Millfield wasn't just watching, they were preparing for something more aggressive. The footage showed men with military equipment staging at a location roughly 10 miles from the solar facility. They're not here to observe, Vale said. They're here to ensure that neither of us leaves this mountain alive. My former colleagues at Aquatech have decided that the water generation technology represents an existential threat to the global water industry. They've spent months trying to locate me, and your journey here has finally given them the opportunity they've been waiting for. Dillon felt the weight of manipulation settling on his shoulders. You used me as bait. I gave you choices at every step, Vale replied firmly. You could have taken the money and walked away after the first location. You could have stopped after the second. Every decision to continue was yours, based on what you learned about the technology and its potential impact. Vale was right, but the knowledge that he'd been maneuvered into this position still stung. Dillon thought about Lily, safely at home with Mrs. Chen, and wondered if his desire to be part of something meaningful had blinded him to the risks he was accepting. The corporate team outside has orders to eliminate both of us and destroy all evidence of the water generation technology, Vale continued. But they also have a weakness. They assume I'm working alone. They don't know about you, which gives us an advantage they won't expect. Vale opened another case, revealing documentation that proved the scope of the conspiracy Dillon had suspected. Communications between Aquatech executives and international water industry leaders showed coordinated efforts to suppress atmospheric water generation technology across multiple countries. The financial stakes were enormous, unlimited. Access to clean water would disrupt markets worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. But here's what they don't understand, Vale said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent months planning for this moment. The technology doesn't have to be suppressed. It can be released in a way that benefits everyone, including the people currently profiting from water scarcity. Vale showed Dillon plans for a global humanitarian foundation that would deploy atmospheric water generation technology in partnership with existing water companies rather than in competition with them. The approach would create new markets for technical support, maintenance, and expansion, while addressing humanitarian needs in regions where traditional water infrastructure wasn't economically viable. The foundation needs someone to run it, Vale said, someone with the moral authority that comes from choosing principles over immediate profit. Someone who found $47 million and used only what they needed to solve an immediate crisis. Dillon understood now why Vale had constructed such an elaborate test. The billionaire hadn't just been looking for someone trustworthy, he'd been looking for someone whose character had been proven under pressure, who could resist the corrupting influence of enormous wealth while maintaining focus on humanitarian goals. "What about the men outside?" Dylan asked. "They're not going to simply let us walk away with this technology." Vale smiled with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this confrontation for months. "That's where your local knowledge becomes invaluable. You know this terrain better than they do. You know which roads lead where, which trails are passable, and most importantly, you know how to disappear into country they can't navigate without local guidance." Vale opened a final case, revealing a complete prototype of the large-scale atmospheric water generation system, along with all the technical documentation needed for global deployment. "This technology belongs to humanity, not to corporations that would suppress it for profit. But getting it to the right people requires surviving the next 24 hours. As if summoned by Vale's words, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the valley. Through the window, Dylan could see headlights moving along the access road toward their position. The corporate team was making their move, confident that they had both men trapped in an isolated location where violence could be explained as an unfortunate accident. "Are you ready to finish what we started?" Vale asked, shouldering a pack that contained the water generation prototypes and documentation. Dylan thought about Lily, about Sarah's memory, and about all the children around the world who deserved access to clean water, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. "I'm ready," he said, understanding that the most dangerous part of Vale's test was just beginning. Vale's solar facility had been designed with this moment in mind. The billionaire led Dylan through a series of preparations that revealed months of careful planning for the confrontation that now approached with the growl of engines echoing off the mountain walls. "The building is equipped with a dead man's switch," Vale explained as he activated a complex communication system. "If we don't check in every 12 hours, all the water generation technology, specifications, and corporate conspiracy evidence gets transmitted simultaneously to the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and every major news outlet in 30 countries. Dylan watched Vale's fingers move across multiple keyboards with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed these procedures many times. "The men outside know about this system, which means they can't simply eliminate us and walk away. They need to capture the facility intact and disable the transmission protocols before they can complete their mission." The tactical situation was complex but not hopeless. Vale's facility occupied a defensible position with only one practical approach road, and the solar power systems could operate independently of outside infrastructure. More importantly, Dylan's knowledge of the local terrain provided escape routes that their corporate adversaries couldn't anticipate. "The key is not to defeat them," Vale said, shouldering a pack that contained the precious prototypes and documentation. "It's to survive long enough for the global transmission to occur. Once that technology reaches humanitarian organizations worldwide, it becomes impossible to suppress." Through the facility's security cameras, Dylan counted at least 6 vehicles approaching their position. Professional mercenaries, heavily armed and coordinated, but operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who'd had months to prepare defensive positions. Vale handed Dylan a device that looked like a sophisticated GPS unit, but functioned as something far more important. "This contains the biometric locks for the transmission system," he explained. "The technology release requires both our genetic signatures to authenticate. If something happens to me, you'll need to complete the sequence within 6 hours, or the system resets and we lose our window." Dylan examined the device, noting its military-grade construction and multiple security features. "Why both of us? Why not just your authorization?" "Because this technology is too important to rest in the hands of one person," Vale replied. "The biometric system ensures that survival requires cooperation. Neither of us can complete the mission alone." The weight of responsibility settled on Dylan's shoulders like a familiar burden. He thought about Lily, probably sleeping peacefully at home while her father prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether life-saving technology reached the people who needed it most. "I need to call my daughter," Dylan said. "If something happens to me, she deserves to know why." Vale nodded, understanding the request of a father facing uncertain odds. "The communication system is secure. They can't trace the call." Dylan's hands shook slightly as he dialed Mrs. Chen's number, praying that Lily would be awake despite the late hour. His daughter's voice, sleepy but concerned, provided the anchor he needed for whatever was coming. "Dad, are you okay? You sound worried." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Dylan said, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that whatever happens, everything I'm doing is because I love you and because I want to make the world a little better for kids like you." "Are you in danger?" Lily asked, with the directness that always surprised him. "I'm being as careful as I can be," Dylan answered honestly. "Mrs. Chen will take good care of you, and there are people who will make sure you're okay no matter what happens to me." "Don't do anything too brave, Dad," Lily said, unconsciously echoing Sarah's words from years earlier. "I need you to come home." Dylan closed his eyes, memorizing the sound of his daughter's voice. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky, Lily. Always remember that." After ending the call, Dylan found Vale making final preparations in the facility's workshop. The billionaire was transferring the most critical prototypes to portable cases, while simultaneously uploading backup files to multiple secure servers around the world. "Your daughter is lucky to have a father willing to fight for her future," Vale said without looking up from his work. "She's lucky to have a father who might survive to see that future," Dylan replied. "What are our actual chances here?" Vale paused in his preparations, considering the question with the analytical mind that had built a technology empire. "Honestly, perhaps 30% if we try to defend this position. Better than 50% if we're willing to abandon the facility and use your knowledge of the terrain to reach the backup transmission site." "There's a backup site, 20 miles north, hidden in an abandoned mine complex that most people don't know exists. The transmission equipment there is less sophisticated, but it's connected to the same global network. If we can reach it with the prototypes and biometric device, we can complete the mission even if they destroy this facility." Dylan studied Vale's topographical maps, identifying the route to the backup location and calculating the time required to reach it on foot through mountain terrain. "That's rough country, especially in the dark. And they'll have tracking equipment. But you know paths they don't," Vale pointed out. "Hunting trails, old mining roads, creek beds that don't appear on their GPS systems. Local knowledge is our greatest advantage." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical whine of electronic equipment being deployed. Through the security cameras, Dylan watched the corporate team establish a perimeter around the facility with military precision. "They're not planning to negotiate," Dylan observed. "No," Vale agreed. "They're planning to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. The only question is whether we're going to let them." Vale activated a series of automated systems that would maintain the facility's appearance of occupation while they escaped through a concealed exit that opened into a natural ravine behind the main building. The deception wouldn't fool the attackers for long, but it might provide the head start necessary to reach defensible terrain. "Once we leave this building," Vale warned, "we're committed to completing the mission or dying in the attempt. The corporate interests behind this suppression campaign have invested too much to allow either of us to walk away with what we know." Dylan thought about the atmospheric water generator he'd tested at the mountain spring, about children around the world who went to bed thirsty, about Lily's future in a world where clean water might finally be available to everyone who needed it. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Let's go save the world," Dylan said, shouldering his pack and following Vale toward the concealed exit that would lead them into the Oregon wilderness and toward the most important night of their lives. Behind them, the automated systems began their programmed sequence of responses designed to buy precious time. Ahead lay 20 miles of treacherous mountain terrain, professional killers with unlimited resources, and the slim chance that two determined men could change the course of human history by ensuring that life-saving technology reached the people who needed it most. The mission that had begun with $47 million hidden in a hollow log was about to reach its climax in the darkness of the Oregon mountains, where survival would depend on courage, local knowledge, and the hope that doing the right thing would prove stronger than corporate greed. The concealed exit led into a ravine that cut deep into the mountainside, providing natural cover from the corporate team's surveillance equipment. Dylan moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years hunting these mountains, while Vale followed with the determined awkwardness of a man more comfortable with laboratories than wilderness survival. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when the night erupted behind them in a series of explosions that lit the darkness like violent dawn. Vale's solar facility was being systematically destroyed, the corporate team eliminating evidence of their mission while ensuring that no trace of the water generation technology remained. "The backup transmission," Dylan whispered urgently. "Will it still work if they've destroyed the main facility?" "The systems are independent," Vale replied, breathing hard from the unaccustomed exertion. "But we have less time than I calculated. They'll realize we've escaped within the hour, and they have tracking equipment designed for exactly this kind of pursuit." Dylan led them deeper into terrain that existed only in the memories of old-time hunters and mining prospectors. Creek beds carved by spring snowmelt provided natural pathways that wouldn't appear on satellite imagery, while game trails offered routes through dense timber that vehicles couldn't follow. But their pursuers were professionals with unlimited resources and no concern for legal niceties. Within an hour, Dylan could hear helicopters in the distance, their searchlights probing the darkness for any sign of movement. Thermal imaging would make concealment difficult, but the broken terrain and thick forest canopy provided some protection from aerial surveillance. "The mine complex is still 15 miles, Dylan calculated, consulting his mental map of the region. "We need to move faster, but the noise discipline becomes critical once we get closer to their search pattern." Vale was struggling more than he wanted to admit, his illness sapping strength that months of preparation couldn't restore. But he pressed forward with the determination of someone who understood that failure meant not just personal death, but the suppression of technology that could save millions of lives. They reached the first major obstacle around midnight, a ridgeline that offered the fastest route to the mine complex, but would expose them to aerial observation for nearly a mile. Dylan studied the terrain through binoculars, noting the regular pattern of helicopter sweeps that suggested coordinated search protocols. "There's a gap in their coverage every 12 minutes, Dylan observed. "If we time it right, we can cross the exposed area during their turnaround phase." Vale checked the biometric device, confirming that the transmission protocols remained active despite the destruction of the main facility. "The backup site has limited power reserves," he warned. "If we don't reach it within 4 hours, the opportunity disappears, and we'll have to find another way to release the technology." Dylan made the decision that would define the next phase of their escape. Instead of taking the safe route that would consume too much time, they would risk exposure to reach the mine complex before dawn. The corporate team expected them to prioritize concealment over speed, which meant aggressive movement might catch them off guard. "Stay close and trust my lead," Dylan instructed as they prepared for the dangerous crossing. "When I say run, we run regardless of what we hear or see." They emerged from tree cover during the calculated gap in helicopter coverage, moving across the exposed ridge with desperate efficiency. Dylan felt completely exposed under the star-filled sky, every instinct screaming that they should seek cover rather than sprint across open ground where thermal imaging could easily detect them. Halfway across the ridge, the inevitable happened. Searchlights swept toward their position as one of the helicopters deviated from its predicted pattern, the pilot apparently spotting movement in an area that should have been empty. "Run!" Dylan shouted, abandoning stealth for speed as they raced toward the tree line that represented temporary safety. The helicopter's spotlight found them just as they reached cover, but not before Dylan had led them into terrain so broken and heavily forested that aerial pursuit became impossible. They could hear the aircraft circling overhead, but the thick canopy and rocky outcroppings provided protection from direct observation. They know our general direction now, Vale said, checking the biometric device again. They'll flood this area with ground teams. Dylan consulted his mental map of the region, identifying alternative routes that would avoid the most obvious approaches to the mine complex. There's an old logging road that connects to the mine from the north. It's been washed out for years, but we can follow the roadbed on foot. They changed direction, angling toward a route that would add distance but reduce the likelihood of encountering search teams deployed along more direct approaches. The night was cold enough that their breath created visible vapor, another potential detection risk that couldn't be avoided. The logging road, when they found it, proved to be a blessing disguised as hardship. Years of erosion had carved deep gullies that provided natural concealment, while fallen trees created obstacles that would slow any ground pursuit. Dylan's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to navigate hazards that would trap unfamiliar searchers. But Vale was weakening with each mile. His cancer-compromised stamina pushed beyond sustainable limits. Dylan found himself torn between the urgency of their mission and concern for his unlikely partner's deteriorating condition. "I can make it," Vale insisted when Dylan suggested a rest stop. "The technology is more important than one man's comfort." Dylan understood the billionaire's determination, but he also recognized the signs of someone approaching complete exhaustion. If Vale collapsed before they reached the transmission site, the biometric authentication system would make completion of their mission impossible. The sound of approaching ground vehicles forced them to abandon the logging road and seek cover in dense timber that would conceal them from pursuit, but also slow their progress toward the increasingly critical deadline. Dylan could see the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon, which meant they had perhaps 2 hours to reach the mine complex and complete the transmission sequence. As they moved through the final miles toward Vale's backup transmission site, Dylan realized that everything he'd learned about courage and sacrifice was about to be tested in the crucible of corporate violence and humanitarian necessity. The water generation technology in Vale's pack represented hope for countless people, but delivering that hope would require surviving the next few hours against opponents who had every advantage except local knowledge and moral certainty. The abandoned mine complex appeared through the trees like a monument to human ambition and industrial decay, its headframe silhouetted against the lightening sky. Somewhere within that maze of tunnels and forgotten machinery lay the equipment that could change the world if they could reach it alive. The abandoned mine complex sprawled across a mountainside like the skeleton of some enormous beast, its rusted machinery and collapsed buildings testament to the boom and bust cycles that had shaped Oregon's mining history. Dylan had explored these tunnels as a teenager, but 20 years of neglect had changed the landscape in ways that made navigation treacherous, even for someone familiar with the layout. Vale led them to what appeared to be a maintenance shed, its exterior deliberately weathered to blend with the surrounding decay. Inside, concealed beneath false flooring, lay the backup transmission equipment that represented their last hope for completing the mission. "The system needs 20 minutes to establish satellite connections and authenticate our biometric signatures," Vale explained as he powered up devices that hummed with quiet efficiency. "Once transmission begins, it can't be stopped or recalled." Dylan positioned himself near the shed's only window, watching for signs of pursuit, while Vale worked with equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for the ramshackle building that concealed it. The corporate team would eventually track them to this location, but the mine complex's maze-like layout provided defensive advantages that trained mercenaries couldn't overcome through superior firepower alone. "How long since we left the facility?" Dylan asked. 4 hours and 17 minutes, Vale replied, his fingers moving across multiple keyboards with practiced precision. "We're cutting it close, but the timing works if nothing goes wrong." As if summoned by Vale's words, the sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the mountainside. The corporate team had finally tracked them to the mine complex, and they were bringing overwhelming force to bear on what they assumed would be the final confrontation. "They'll surround the complex and work inward," Dylan predicted, drawing on his father's military training. But they don't know which building contains the transmission equipment, which gives us some time. Vale continued his preparations, while Dillon watched the systematic deployment of professional killers around the perimeter of the mine complex. At least 20 men, armed with military-grade equipment and coordinated through sophisticated communication systems. The kind of force that suggested corporate interests with unlimited budgets and no concern for legal consequences. Transmission sequence initiated, Vale announced. 16 minutes until global deployment begins. Dillon felt a surge of hope mixed with desperation. They were so close to success that he could almost taste it. But 16 minutes might as well be 16 hours if they couldn't survive the assault that was clearly being prepared outside. The first probe came as expected, a small team approaching the most obvious building, while the majority of the force remained in overwatch positions. Dillon watched them clear each structure with professional efficiency, eliminating hiding places and potential ambush sites with methodical thoroughness. 12 minutes, Vale said, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the transmission equipment. The satellite connections are stable, but they need continuous power to complete the upload sequence. Dillon studied the approaching search pattern and made a tactical decision that would have horrified his father, but seemed like their best chance for survival. Instead of waiting for the corporate team to discover their location, he would create a diversion that drew them away from the transmission site. "Keep working," Dillon told Vale. "I'm going to give them something else to think about." Before Vale could object, Dillon slipped out of the maintenance shed and moved through the mine complex toward a position that would allow him to engage the search teams without compromising the transmission site. He carried nothing more than his hunting rifle and the hope that local knowledge could overcome superior numbers and equipment. The first confrontation came sooner than expected. Dillon encountered a two-man team clearing one of the larger buildings, their tactical movements precise but predictable to someone who understood the terrain. A single, well-placed shot eliminated the lead searcher before his partner could identify the threat's location. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire corporate force converged on Dillon's position, with suppressing fire that shattered windows and sent fragments of rusted metal flying through the air like deadly confetti. But Dillon was already moving, using the complex's network of tunnels and collapsed structures to stay ahead of his pursuers. 8 minutes, came Vale's voice through the radio Dillon carried. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Dillon continued his deadly game of hide-and-seek through the mine complex, using every advantage his familiarity with the terrain provided. But professional killers with unlimited ammunition and thermal imaging equipment would eventually corner him unless the transmission completed before they could coordinate an effective response. The cat-and-mouse game continued through collapsed tunnels and around rusted machinery that created deadly obstacles for anyone unfamiliar with their placement. Dillon managed to eliminate 2 more searchers while staying ahead of the main force, but he could feel the net closing around his position with each passing minute. 4 minutes, Vale reported. The upload is at 70% completion. Dillon found himself trapped in a section of the complex where multiple search teams had coordinated to cut off his escape routes. Professional voices called coordinates through radio systems that turned individual hunters into a coordinated killing machine. He had perhaps 30 seconds before overwhelming firepower would converge on his position. The solution came from an unexpected source. Vale's voice crackled through the radio with an urgency that cut through the tactical situation like a blade. "Dillon, the transmission is complete. The technology is deploying globally as we speak. Nothing they do now can stop it." The knowledge changed everything. Dillon's mission was no longer survival, it was ensuring that Vale could escape to oversee the humanitarian deployment of technology that was already beyond corporate suppression. The billionaire's life had become more valuable than his own. Dillon made the choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. Instead of continuing to evade his pursuers, he emerged from cover and engaged the corporate team directly, drawing their full attention while Vale escaped through tunnels that led away from the transmission site. The final firefight was brief but decisive. Dylan's position became untenable within minutes, but those minutes allowed Vale to disappear into terrain where even professional killers couldn't follow someone who knew every tunnel and hidden exit. As Dylan's world narrowed to the immediate requirements of survival against overwhelming odds, he felt a profound sense of completion. The atmospheric water generation technology was beyond suppression, deploying through humanitarian networks that would deliver clean water to people who needed it most. Lily would grow up in a world where no child went thirsty simply because their family couldn't afford clean water. And somewhere in the maze of abandoned tunnels beneath the Oregon mountains, Rowan Vale carried the knowledge needed to ensure that technology served humanity rather than corporate profit. The mission that had begun with $47 million hidden in a hollow log was ending with something far more valuable: the certainty that doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost, could indeed change the world. 3 months later, Dylan sat in the comfortable office of the Hart Family Foundation, watching news reports about the first atmospheric water generation plants coming online in drought-stricken regions of East Africa. The technology that Rowan Vale had died protecting was transforming communities where clean water had been a daily struggle for generations. Dylan's injuries from the mine complex confrontation had healed, though he still carried scars that reminded him daily of the price of courage. The corporate team had eventually retreated when local law enforcement arrived to investigate reports of gunfire, but not before Vale had made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the technology's global deployment. The billionaire's body had been found 3 days later in a collapsed mine tunnel, clutching the scholarship fund documents that would become his final gift to struggling families. The corporate conspiracy had unraveled quickly once the atmospheric water generation technology became public. Aquatech Industries board members faced federal charges for conspiracy and attempted murder, while the company itself had been restructured under international humanitarian oversight. The water industry's attempts to suppress life-saving technology had created the very scandal that ended their monopolistic practices. But the real victory was visible in the faces of children who now had access to clean water in places where it had never existed before. The atmospheric water generation plants, built using Vale's open-source specifications, were producing millions of gallons of clean water daily in refugee camps, drought-affected villages, and disaster zones around the world. Lily knocked on Dylan's office door, her backpack heavy with homework from the private school that Vale's scholarship fund now made possible. Her health had improved dramatically since the pneumonia scare, aided by excellent medical care that was no longer a financial burden for their family. "Dad, Mrs. Martinez wants to know if you can speak to her students about water conservation next week," Lily said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Dylan smiled at his daughter, noting how much she'd grown in confidence since their lives had stabilized. The Hart Family Foundation operated from a renovated building in downtown Millfield, providing college scholarships to single-parent families and funding clean water projects in communities that needed them most. "What would you like me to tell them?" Dylan asked. "That sometimes the most important treasures are the ones you give away," Lily replied with the wisdom that continued to surprise him. Dylan had indeed learned that lesson through experience that transformed both his understanding of wealth and his sense of purpose. Vale's $47 million had become the foundation's endowment, generating income that would support humanitarian work for generations while preserving the principle for maximum long-term impact. The scholarship fund bore Sarah's name, honoring the memory of the woman whose compassion had shaped Dylan's approach to sudden wealth. Each year, 50 families received assistance with college expenses, medical bills, and emergency housing, the kind of support that Dylan had desperately needed during his darkest months. "There's something else," Lily said, pulling a folded paper from her backpack. "I wrote a story for English class about a man who found treasure in the forest." Dylan read his daughter's story with growing amazement. She had somehow captured the essence of his journey with Vale, transforming it into a fairy tale about a woodcutter who discovered that the greatest magic was helping others find what they needed most. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Dylan said. "What gave you the idea?" "You did." Lily replied simply. When you found that thing in the woods, you changed. Not just because we had money, but because you found something to do with your life that made you happy. That evening, Dylan walked through downtown Millfield, noting the changes that had come to their small town since the Hart Family Foundation had established its headquarters there. New businesses were thriving, young families were moving to the area, and the main street no longer carried the defeated atmosphere of economic decline. Mrs. Chen had become the foundation's office manager, bringing the same caring efficiency to charitable work that she'd applied to managing rental properties. Pete Peterson served on the board of directors, ensuring that the foundation's work remained connected to the practical needs of working families. But the most meaningful change was less visible. Dylan had found purpose beyond mere survival, work that honored both Sarah's memory and Vale's sacrifice, while building a legacy that would benefit people he would never meet. The Foundation's clean water projects now operated in 12 countries, bringing atmospheric water generation technology to communities where children no longer went to bed thirsty. As Dylan reached the memorial bench the town had installed in Vale's honor, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a desperate father, cutting firewood, into someone whose decisions affected thousands of lives around the world. The bench bore a simple inscription: Rowan Vale, engineer, humanitarian, visionary. The water flows upward through acts of courage. Dylan's phone buzzed with a message from the Foundation's field coordinator in Sudan, reporting that the latest atmospheric water generation plant was exceeding production targets and serving a refugee camp of 15,000 people. The technology that Vale had died protecting was literally saving lives every day, proving that one person's courage could indeed change the world. The stars were particularly bright that night, reminding Dylan of Sarah's belief that important people never really left as long as their influence continued to ripple outward through time. Vale's humanitarian vision was spreading across the globe, while Sarah's compassion guided the Foundation's work, with families facing the same struggles Dylan had known. Walking home to the comfortable house he now shared with Lily on the outskirts of Millfield, Dylan felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his life served purposes larger than himself. The fortune he'd found in a hollow log had been just the beginning. The real treasure was the opportunity to ensure that other families never faced the desperate choices that had once kept him awake at night. Lily was waiting in the kitchen with hot chocolate and the request for a bedtime story. As Dylan began telling her about communities around the world where children could now drink clean water thanks to technology that turned air into hope, he understood that the greatest inheritance he could leave his daughter wasn't money, but the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose purpose over profit. The atmospheric water generation plants continued their quiet work through the night, pulling moisture from desert air and transforming it into the most precious gift imaginable. And in a small Oregon town, a former carpenter tucked his daughter into bed with the certainty that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to honor the memory of a billionaire who had trusted him with the power to change the world.